Welcome to History 120. This is our last week of the semester, and we're going to talk about Reconstruction this week. Reconstruction lays the groundwork for much of the civil rights issues in this nation that follow in the years to come. We don't do a very good job in this nation of addressing the history of race and the problems that slavery created and still linger in our society today. And in many ways, the way Reconstruction handles the issue is at the root of it as well. It's 1865. The Civil War is over. Nearly 750,000 American men are dead. Major southern cities have been destroyed, burned to the ground by armies, and massive amounts of destruction rule the South. The only bright thing to come out of this is that slavery has been ended. The 13th Amendment was signed in 1865, passed by the process for the creation of new constitutional amendments. But all the 13th Amendment does is end slavery. It gives freedom to former slaves. It doesn't create citizenship. It doesn't create civil rights or mechanisms to enforce civil rights. And so we have a tangible unknown going on with former slaves in 1865. We don't know what our future as a nation will be, and we don't know how to heal, how to move forward in the wake of the American Civil War. And so here's our starting point. There are 35.2 million Americans. Around 650 to 750,000 people are dead. This number is in a little bit of a flux right now. Some historians in the last couple of years have attempted to go back and recalculate the actual number of war-related deaths. And we used to say 500 to 600,000. Now we're trying to hedge this up a little bit higher. To put that into perspective, that's about 3% of the American population. This would be millions of people dead in today's world. 4 million African Americans are free, but we're not exactly sure what their status is going to be and what place they'll have in American society. All major southern cities are in ruin. There's no great financial infrastructure left. The railroads in the South have been torn up. The South has been paralyzed economically and physically. So we've done a good job over the last 4 years of destroying ourselves. So what are we going to do in order to deal with the situation at hand? Unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated within weeks of the war ending, so we don't know for sure what Lincoln wanted to do with Reconstruction. Obviously, in 1863, he had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which only freed slaves that were living outside of the United States, in areas uncontrolled by the Union Army. In many ways, the Emancipation Proclamation really does nothing. It gives the war a higher purpose, but it doesn't actually free anybody. But what we do get, starting in 1863, is something that we call the 10% Plan. It's technically called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. The reason it's called the Louisiana 10% Plan is Louisiana is recaptured by federal forces very early in the conflict. New Orleans falls early in 1862, and so most of Louisiana is in Union hands by 1863. And we need to formulate a way for dealing with Louisiana. Is it conquered territory? Does it want to become a state again? Has it always been a state? And so, what Lincoln and the Republicans in Congress come up with is a plan wherein 10% of the voting population from 1860 need to go to the polls, or there will be a referendum at the polls, a public vote. And if 10% of the voters who were eligible to vote in 1860 choose to ratify this referendum to come back into the Union, they'll be accepted. They have to accept the Emancipation Proclamation. They have to support the Union war effort. In some areas, this could be very hard to implement because there may not be very many voting men left, either because they're in the military or because they've died. But essentially, what Lincoln is doing with this plan, and your book goes into much greater detail on this, but what Lincoln is trying to do with the 10% plan is to create a relatively quick mechanism for the return of former rebellious states into the Union without punishing the South. The war is punishing enough. The end of slavery is going to be punishing enough. Lincoln doesn't want to seek retribution from the Southern states for seceding and starting the war. He wants to reconcile as quickly as possible. And so the 10% plan sets a relatively low bar for how to bring former rebellious states back into the Union. But keep in mind, just because this is how things were playing out in 1863 doesn't necessarily mean that this is what Lincoln would have wanted at the end of the war. The problem is we don't know for sure. John Wilkes Booth and his Derringer will forever make this an unanswerable question. With Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson becomes president. Johnson is actually a Democrat. He's a war Democrat, someone who supports the Union war effort, despite the fact that the Democrats are seen as the party of secession and the party of conservatives who support traditional rights. Johnson may be a Democrat, but he supports the Union above all else. He was actually made the vice presidential candidate in 1864 in order to attract the votes of loyal Southerners. Technically, the Republican Party wasn't on the ballot in 1864, it was the Union Party. And to have a Democratic Southerner on the same ticket as a Republican Midwesterner was to show the unity of the party across regions. There was no conception of Andrew Johnson ever becoming president or ever doing anything in public. People could not stand him. He was a drunk. He was semi-literate. He was obnoxious. People just kind of hated Andrew Johnson generally. But as I said, the bullet fired by John Wilkes Booth makes Andrew Johnson president. And he personally feels that Reconstruction is unnecessary. These states had been American states. They will be American states again. The federal government doesn't need to do any extraordinary measures to bring these states back into the fold. Andrew Johnson was also a virulent white supremacist, and he supported new laws that were emerging in the South that were known as black codes. What black codes did is essentially they were trying to create slavery without calling it slavery. Black codes were laws that prohibited the actions of African Americans and particularly African American males in public in the South in the wake of the Civil War. Um, Black codes very often outlawed black people from having guns, from obtaining alcohol, where they could work. You had to have work papers on you to prove that you had a job at all times, or else you could be arrested for vagrancy. And if a black man and a white man were both arrested for vagrancy, the white man might serve a couple of days in jail, or he might be escorted to the city limits and told never to come back. The black man might be sentenced to weeks or months in prison for his heinous crime of walking down the street without papers proving his employment or lounging around. These were an effort, as I said, these were an effort to essentially codify a new form of slavery and white supremacy wherein whites were um, sheltered, if one might, from the presence of African Americans, and that African Americans needed to maintain a subservient position in society, a second class status in American society. It's all about the suppression of rights. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that after the war, with the rise of these black codes, African American men could be jailed for any number of offenses. They had to prove unreasonably the fact that they were employed in order to stay out of jail. It's essentially it's a way to use jail as a point of segregation. We're just going to jail black men who we don't want to see around and who represent a threat to Southern society just by their mere presence. One of the things that we see growing in this period is the use of convict leasing. There's a massive labor shortage in the South following the American Civil War, and you think, well, why? A whole bunch of people died, but there's people that still need jobs. The problem is agricultural labor as done in the South needed to be done by slaves in order to be profitable. With slavery ended, these tasks and many other tasks are not as profitable or profitable at all when you have to pay an hourly wage to workers. But there's a workaround for this. Our jails, Southern jails, are filling with young African American men who are being arrested for vagrancy laws. They're being arrested for being black and male on the street. And the jails are filling up. What are we going to do with them? Well, Southern towns, Southern states create the framework for renting out prisoners as a means of finding labor to do tasks on farms, to do tasks in towns, and if in factories, any number of 100 different items. Convicts are leased out for cutting timber, hauling wood, agricultural work. Essentially, if you name it, a convict can do it, and a convict can do it very cheaply. Essentially, the sheriff is using people in his jail as a means of raising revenue for his jail. And keep in mind, this is not paying for your own keep while you're in jail. This is an incredibly profitable exercise for Southern sheriffs. They are able to make money publicly and privately through corrupt means, through the uh, rental of convicts to do labor. Essentially, we're creating male African American bondage by another name. That's what convict leasing is. In Washington, we start seeing a push for a new form of reform in the wake of the Civil War. What we are essentially talking about is the rise of the radical Republicans. These are pro-war Republicans, anti-slavery Republicans, anti-Southern Republicans who have come to power in the elections of 1864. They dominate Congress, and they see this as an opportunity to radically reframe Southern society in the wake of the war. They're going to end slavery. They want to pass legislation that promotes human rights. They claim that secession negates statehood, and as such, states need to be forced to go through a rigorous process to be readmitted to the Union. The radical Republicans claim also that only Congress can control Reconstruction, not the president. They openly opposed Johnson. They opposed presidential Reconstruction. And we're coming to a point where there's more and more conflict between Congress and the president over the questions of the actions in the South, what federal policy should be, what's going to go on. One of the items that Congress creates in this period is the Freedmen's Bureau. This is actually one of the few institutions that the United States government is going to establish in order to try and assist former slaves in finding a new life in the wake of war. There's no real redistribution of property. There's no real redistribution of wealth. By and large, at the end of the war, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, we tell African Americans, you're free, go live a free life. There's no assistance granted them in developing the mechanisms of a free life. There's also no preparation given them for operating in a world that honestly may not want them around. We have to face that fact. And so what the Freedmen's Bureau does is it steps in and creates state bureaus and local bureaus. It's run by the Army. And the job of the Freedmen's Bureau is in some way to ease the transition of former slaves into freedom. Well, what do we have to do that? Well, if you're illiterate, which the vast majority of the Southern slave population is, when you go to find a new job, you're going to sign a labor contract. If you can't read, how do you know what you're signing? How do you know what the terms are? How do you know what you're getting paid, etc.? So the Freedmen's Bureau is going to help these workers negotiate fair contracts for pay and hours and treatment. It's also going to establish schools across the South, not just for the children of former slaves, so that the kids can go to school and learn how to read and write and function in the world. It's going to educate adults as well, so that they can read these contracts, so they can read the newspaper, so they can be informed citizens, so they can operate in a world where they're no longer told what to do on a daily, minute-to-minute basis, where they have agency in their lives, more agency than previously. The Freedmen's Bureau is going to help build schools, build churches. It's really going to do the work of helping these former slaves find their place in society. The Freedmen's Bureau is also going to help enforce any and all civil rights legislation that is passed. It's going to help defend the rights of African Americans in the face of a very hostile Southern society. A great example of this is this cartoon, which was published originally in Harper's Weekly, that shows the Freedmen's Bureau as a wall defending former slaves, including Union Army veterans from U.S. colored troop regiments, defending them from the assaults physically and civilly by a Southern society that had just gone to war based on slavery and based on the concepts of white supremacy. And this is something we need to remember about the American Civil War. If you look throughout the secession ordinances, if you look at so many documents left behind by individuals and various governments that were operating within the Confederacy, the state governments, federal governments, Southern states secede from the Union when Abraham Lincoln is elected president because they feel or fear that he is going to pass legislation that ends slavery, despite the fact that he said time and again that he would not. The war is about slavery. The war is about white supremacy. And so in the post-war years, the Freedmen's Bureau is acting in some ways as the only bulwark defending African American civil liberties on the local level. I'll go ahead and give you more. We'll have more lecture coming up in where we talk about more policies about Reconstruction. We're also going to talk about how Reconstruction comes to an end and the legacies of Reconstruction. Thanks for watching.